The year was 1861, and the United States stood at the precipice of disaster as secession tore the nation apart from within the southern states, infuriated by what they saw as federal overreach and the threat to their slave-based economies, declared their independence from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America, while gunpowder and blood began to paint the American landscape across the Atlantic. In England, a storm of a different kind was brewing, though distant from. The battlefields of Gettysburg and Antietam, England, was not an idle spectator. The Civil War was more than just an internal American conflict. It was a crisis, with far-reaching implications for global politics, trade, and the very ideology of empire. The English elite, divided in opinion, watched the unfolding events with a mix of fascination, horror, and opportunity. In the smoky clubs of London and drawing rooms of the aristocracy, debates flared over whether to support the Union or the Confederacy. Ideologically, the British detested slavery on moral grounds, yet economically they were dependent on Southern cotton, the lifeblood of their thriving textile industry known as King Cotton, and shipped from the American South to Lancashire's Hungary. Mills as Southern ports were blockaded by the Union Navy. The cries from the cotton-starved workers in Manchester and Liverpool grew louder, desperate for work and wages. Many British merchants and industrialists began to sympathize with the Confederacy, hoping that an independent South would ensure a steady cotton supply, yet support was not unanimous. British abolitionists passionately backed the Union, seeing the war as a crusade to end slavery, and some even organized public rallies urging the government to remain neutral or side with the North Prime Minister Lord Palmerston, known for his cautious and pragmatic foreign policy, tried to walk the tightrope maintaining British neutrality while also ensuring the empire's global interests were not threatened. His government issued a proclamation of neutrality early in the conflict, but the implications of British involvement loomed large on the horizon, especially as Confederate envoys like James Mason and John Slidell attempted to seek diplomatic recognition from European powers. The real test of British neutrality came in November 1861 with the Trent affair, when a Union warship intercepted a British mail packet and captured the Confederate diplomats, sparking outrage across Britain and threatening war with the United States in a matter of days. Parliament roared with indignation, demanding reparations and an apology. The British military began preparations for potential conflict, even reinforcing its presence in Canada. The tension was palpable. War seemed imminent until cooler heads prevailed, and President Lincoln released the Confederate envoys. Avoiding further escalation, the Trent affair was a stark reminder to both sides that England was not a passive entity in the American crisis. Even without troops on the ground, its economic, political, and diplomatic weight could tip the balance of the war, and that reality haunted every decision made in both Washington and Richmond as the war raged on. England would continue to play its role in whispers through trade, in secret through shipbuilding, and in silence through policy. As the smoke of war choked American skies across the sea, England's indirect influence would prove to be one of the most defining shadows cast over the bloodied fields of the Civil War. As the Union blockade tightened around southern ports, the Confederacy turned to England not only for sympathy, but for lifelines to survive. Trade routes that had once freely flowed with cotton now stood choked by Northern warships, and in their desperation, Confederate leaders knew that if they could bypass the blockade through British support, they could gain access to weapons, ammunition, and vital supplies. Thus began the era of the blockade runners, sleek, fast steamships built in English shipyards like those in Liverpool and Glasgow, painted in grays to blend with the sea and built to outrun Union cruisers. These vessels became the arteries of the Confederate economy, smuggling out cotton and bringing back guns and powder. The British government officially remained neutral, but neutrality was a gray word in wartime. Some merchants, motivated by profit, others by sympathy, turned a blind eye to what their ships were carrying and where they were bound. Among the most controversial of these operations was the construction of the CSS Alabama, a warship commissioned by Confederate agents and built secretly in the British port of Birkenhead under the guise of a merchant vessel, the Alabama would go on to wreak havoc on Union commerce, capturing and destroying over 60 Northern merchant ships during its 2-year reign at sea. The Union protested furiously, accusing Britain of violating neutrality and enabling piracy. And while the British government eventually attempted to clamp down on such activities, the damage had already been done. England's shipyards were fueling the Confederate war machine, and every British-built cannon that thundered across the Atlantic echoed in American ears. Yet the impact of this indirect involvement was not felt only in distant oceans or secret docks. It was also visible in the starving faces of English workers. The Lancashire cotton famine, as it came to be known, brought misery to thousands as mills closed and employment evaporated. And yet, in a twist of conscience, many of those workers chose not to support the Confederacy, despite their suffering. Letters from Manchester laborers supporting the Union cause even reached Abraham Lincoln, who would later write back, thanking them for their moral courage. England's working class seemed to understand that supporting slavery even indirectly was a betrayal of their own struggle for dignity and rights. But the aristocracy and the wealthy merchants did not always share that view. For them, the war was a geopolitical chess game, an opportunity to see a rival power weakened and possibly divided forever, while official recognition of the Confederacy never came close. British diplomats kept lines of communication open, weighing the possibility, should the South show signs of victory. They played both sides, carefully avoiding entanglement, but always watching, always measuring what their next move might gain. In Parliament, debates raged, with every major battle reported in American newspapers, becoming headlines in the Times and in elite salons. Heated arguments broke out over what moral or economic obligations Britain had, if any. British foreign policy found itself stretched between ideals and interests, between public opinion and private gain, as the war dragged on. The cost of silence and the price of neutrality grew heavier with each passing month, though no British soldier would set foot on the battlefield. Their weapons, their ships, and their decisions would help shape the war's bloody tide from afar. And in this transatlantic dance of politics and pragmatism, England's indirect role in the American Civil War deepened into one of quiet influence, decisive consequence, and lasting controversy. In the grand halls of Whitehall, behind velvet drapes and beneath flickering gaslights, English diplomats whispered strategies that could reshape the world. The American Civil War was not just a domestic crisis. It was a global test of allegiances and ideologies, and for England, the stakes were both moral and imperial in the corridors of power. Foreign Secretary Lord John Russell was besieged by conflicting interests. Confederate representatives James Mason and John Slidell continued their campaign to gain diplomatic recognition for the South, traveling across Europe, but especially pressing their case in Britain. They promised cotton access commercial partnership, and even flattered British aristocracy by appealing to shared traditions of hierarchy and regional autonomy. Yet despite mounting pressure, neither Russell nor Prime Minister Palmerston committed to recognizing the Confederacy. It was not that they sympathized with the Union entirely, but they feared the consequences of picking the wrong side. Recognition could mean war with the United States, a war Britain could ill afford, with unrest brewing in Ireland, tensions in India, and an empire stretched. Across continents, discretion was paramount. Still, the Confederate hope never faded entirely. They believed that a decisive Southern military victory would shift the tide of diplomacy. They also banked on the economic desperation of the cotton famine to force the British hand, and indeed, in 1860 to 1863, famine reached catastrophic levels in Lancashire mill towns, where looms once roared now fell. Silent food banks became lifelines, and families starved with empty hearths and hollow cheeks. The cry of cotton became louder in Parliament, and the Confederacy's dream of intervention flickered back to life. Yet something remarkable happened. Amidst this suffering, British public sentiment tilted toward the Union, not out of allegiance to Abraham Lincoln, but out of shared conviction against slavery. The publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin had stirred moral outrage across England, and reports of Southern slave auctions only deepened the disgust. British newspapers from the Times to the Manchester Guardian published articles condemning the Confederate cause, framing it not as a fight for freedom from tyranny, but a desperate attempt to preserve human bondage. Union diplomats, particularly Charles Francis Adams, son of former U.S. President John Quincy Adams, worked tirelessly to solidify this perception. He met with British officials day after day, methodically exposing Confederate propaganda and revealing the real stakes of the war. Adams made it clear that recognition of the Confederacy would mean war with the Union, and he did not bluff. He warned that Union forces would see it as a hostile act, and that American ships would not hesitate to strike British interests at sea and perhaps even in Canada. His calm yet relentless persistence wore down many British officials who realized that aiding the South could trigger a global conflict they could not contain in many ways. Adams's diplomacy was as vital as any Union battlefield victory. He made British neutrality not just an official stance, but a moral imperative. By late 1863, the tide of war had shifted in favor of the Union major victories. At Gettysburg and Vicksburg shattered Confederate momentum and made the Southern cause seem increasingly doomed, with no clear path to victory. British investment interest waned, and those who had bet on Southern success began hedging their political and financial losses. The cotton famine, too, began to ease, with alternate sources such as Egyptian and Indian cotton entering the British market. These new trade routes lessened economic dependency on the Confederacy and made the cost of Southern alliance appear far less enticing. Meanwhile, the Alabama claims, as they came to be known, began to dominate U.S.-British relations. These were damages the United States sought for the havoc caused by British-built Confederate raiders, especially the CSS Alabama, which alone had destroyed millions worth of Northern shipping. When the war ended in 1865, the U.S. turned its diplomatic attention back to Britain, pressing for reparations in what would become one of the most contentious international arbitration cases of the century. While Britain ultimately paid the United States $15.5 million in gold in 1872 to settle the Alabama claims, the episode left a bitter taste in American mouths and a stain on Britain's reputation as a neutral power. But more than that, it illustrated just how deeply the empire had been entangled in a war it had never formally joined. The British government had walked a narrow tightrope balancing public morality, private interest, imperial caution, and economic necessity. Though it never sent troops nor formally took sides, its ports, its factories, its shipyards, and its diplomats had all played silent yet significant parts in the great American tragedy. The war tested Britain's identity as a moral leader and an empire builder, and while it avoided open conflict, its legacy in the American Civil War is one of quiet consequence and indirect intervention, an empire that never fired a shot but left fingerprints on nearly every corner of a divided nation's struggle for unity and justice. As the American Civil War entered its bloodiest years, England's shadow continued to stretch quietly across the Atlantic, shaping not only the logistics of battle, but the very hope of survival for the Confederate States. It was not the cry of cavalry charges, nor the thunder of artillery that England provided, but the dull grind of machinery in Liverpool, docks, the sound of hammers striking steel in Glasgow shipyards, and the rustle of gold exchanged in backroom deals. London financiers, though publicly removed from war, became key enablers of Confederate operations. Southern agents operating with aliases and forged documents worked with British banks to secure loans that would fund arms purchases and supply chains. They masked transactions behind false flags. They contracted ships through third parties, and they flooded British markets with Confederate bonds promising enormous returns. Should the South prevail, the war thus took on a second face in England, a silent economy of speculation and silent consent, where morality often gave way to mercantile ambition, and as the industrial empire of Britain subtly fueled a slaveholding. Rebellion questions began to emerge not only in politics but in pulpits and press rooms. How could a nation that had abolished slavery in its own dominions in 1833 indirectly support those who fought to preserve it? The contradiction did not go unnoticed. English abolitionists fought to expose these hypocrisies. Some of the loudest voices came not from Parliament, but from the working class and religious communities in the northern towns of England, towns already suffering from the cotton famine. People began to organize not against the Union for starving them, but against their own elites for enabling the South. Manchester famously held rallies where speakers praised Abraham Lincoln and condemned the Confederate cause. For many, this was more than foreign policy. It was a moral reckoning. The workers who had nothing chose to side with those who stood against slavery. Even if it meant empty pockets, their solidarity did not go unrecognized when word of these demonstrations reached the White House. Abraham Lincoln wrote a letter to the working men of Manchester, thanking them for their courage and principle. It was one of the most powerful transatlantic affirmations of the Union cause, and a rebuke to those in England who sought profit from human bondage, yet profit still flowed, and with it so did consequence. The Confederacy's dependence on British shipbuilding and finance created diplomatic fault lines that threatened to erupt into open conflict. The CSS Alabama, the most infamous British-built Confederate cruiser, had captured or sunk over 60 Union merchant ships by late 1864, effectively creating an economic war on northern shipping, and when Union vessels finally caught and sank the Alabama off the coast of France. The event marked not only the end of a maritime scourge, but also the beginning of a diplomatic war of words between Washington and London. The United States blamed Britain not just for the Alabama, but for the broader pattern of unofficial support. They demanded reparations and apologies. And while Britain denied official complicity, it could not escape the fact that its shipyards had indeed launched Confederate raiders. The legal ambiguity of neutrality was now a weapon itself, and it would soon reshape international maritime law. In the war's final year, as Sherman marched through Georgia and Grant closed in on Lee, British interest in the Confederacy, soured investors began dumping Confederate bonds at pennies on the pound. Southern diplomats found fewer doors open and fewer ears willing to listen. The dream of British recognition had faded, not in fire or fury, but in the cold calculation of politics by 1865 with the Confederacy. In ruins and Lincoln preparing to preserve the Union, once and for all, England turned inward, reflecting on its role in the conflict that had nearly pulled it into war. The newspapers that had once printed daily maps of American battlefields now turned to debates over what kind of future Anglo-American relations should take. The legacy of British neutrality remained hotly debated. Some viewed it as a masterstroke of imperial caution, others as a cowardly abdication of moral responsibility. But all agreed on one point: England had not been a bystander. It had been an actor in the wings, manipulating props, whispering cues, and occasionally dimming the lights. It had sent no armies, but had helped build the ships that turned tides. It had raised no flags, but had brokered the loans that bought bullets. Its hands were never stained with blood, but its fingerprints were everywhere, from the cotton markets of Liverpool to the ironclads of Charleston. England had walked the line between friend and foe, watching as a divided America bled itself toward unity. The consequences of that choice would echo for decades. In 1871, the United States formally brought the Alabama claims before an international arbitration tribunal. It was a landmark case, the first major attempt to resolve a dispute between two great powers through legal means rather than war. The court sided with the United States, and Britain was ordered to pay $15.5 million in gold to compensate. For damages, the verdict was accepted and peace held, but the message was clear. Neutrality was no longer a shield for indirect aggression. The rules of empire were changing, shaped in part by a war that had reshaped America and exposed the fragility of British ideals and interests alike. In the years that followed, historians, politicians, and ordinary citizens would revisit the war and ask again and again what was England's role in the great American tragedy, and though there would never be a simple answer, The truth lay somewhere between silence and strategy, between ships and speeches, between principle and profit. For in the end, England's indirect role in the Civil War had been one of power, without presence, influence, without invasion, and impact, without inscription on the battlefield monuments. It had been a shadow not cast, but chosen a place in history, not taken, but accepted quietly, reluctantly, inevitably, when the guns finally fell silent and the Confederate banners were lowered. Under the weight of defeat, the American Civil War entered history as one of the bloodiest and most transformative conflicts ever witnessed, yet far from the battlefields and the charred plantations beyond the silent witness of Gettysburg and the ruins of Richmond, another narrative lingered, one written not in blood but in silence. England's indirect role in the war remained a story of restraint strategy and unresolved consequence, for while the Union emerged victorious and slavery was abolished, the scars between Washington and London had deepened in subtle yet significant ways. The war had exposed the fragile trust between two nations who shared a language but not always a vision, and the shadow of British neutrality would remain. Long after the war drums stopped, British merchants, shipbuilders, bankers, and speculators had played both sides, but in doing so had made choices that shaped the world. The Alabama Claims Arbitration settled one aspect of the damage with a gold payment, but it could not repair the reputational cost. Britain had stood as a moral empire, yet failed to decisively oppose the Confederacy. It had abolished slavery, yet allowed its industries to feed a war defending it. It had promised neutrality, yet turned a blind eye to blockade runners and clandestine contracts. It was this quiet contradiction that historians would grapple with for generations to come. The war had shown how empires could influence conflicts not by fighting them, but by financing them, and in doing so had helped redraw the boundaries of diplomatic accountability. After the war, the United States took a more assertive stance in foreign policy, unwilling to tolerate European meddling in the Western Hemisphere, a sentiment that would eventually evolve into doctrines of dominance, while England recalibrated its imperial vision, realizing that indirect influence came with both profit and peril. America's industrial might surged in the post-war era, and its memory of British ambiguity lingered just beneath the surface of diplomacy as iron rails stretched westward across the continent and new factories roared into life. The old wounds of war remained bandaged, but not forgotten in England, too. The war left marks not on the land, but in the conscience. The textile mills of Lancashire recovered slowly, fueled now by Indian, Egyptian, and later American cotton once again. But the moral pride of the working class who stood by the Union cause endured their solidarity. Across oceans had proven that empire was not just about crowns and colonies, but about people and principles that sometimes defied the will of governments. The political elite in Britain had avoided war, but the cost of neutrality was a loss of moral clarity, and as the Victorian age pressed forward, filled with its own challenges, revolutions, and reforms, the Civil War served as a haunting reminder of what happens when justice is balanced against economic interest. In the end, England's indirect role was neither heroic nor villainous, but profoundly human, marked by hesitation, contradiction, and a constant weighing of risk versus reward. It was a lesson in the limits of empire, a reflection of how great powers often shape history, not in speeches or battles, but in decisions made behind closed doors, in investments made in shadow and in silences that speak louder than declarations. And though no British soldier died at Antietam and no British flag flew at Appomattox, the fingerprints of England remained on the soul of that conflict, a subtle influence that helped define the course of nations across two continents, and for all the ironclads built, and cotton bales weighed, for all the letters penned, and envoys sent the truest legacy of Britain's involvement, may be this a warning that neutrality is never neutral when human freedom hangs in the balance, and a reminder that history is not only written by those who win, but also by those who watch from across the water, shaping outcomes in quiet ways that echo long after the final shot is fired.